Welcome to Shadow Fable. Don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy unsettling tales that creep beneath the skin. Tonight's story begins with an antique puppet, but this isn't a tale of childish fun or old-world charm. This is about control, and losing it completely. The first time Marcus Reeves saw the Marionette, it was hanging in the corner of a cluttered estate shop in rural Pennsylvania, half hidden behind a coat rack and a chipped Victorian mirror. He almost didn't notice it, the way its eyes were too glassy, the way its carved smile seemed a little too wide. It was grotesquely human in its craftsmanship, with delicate wooden hands, painted lips that curled just enough to be unsettling, and joints that had clearly been repaired dozens of times. Marcus had never owned a puppet before. He was a woodworker by trade, a lifelong bachelor nearing 50, known in his small town for restoring old furniture with a surgeon's care. He had a quiet life, methodical and peaceful, but something about the Marionette caught him off guard. A sense of nostalgia he couldn't place, like seeing a face you're certain you've dreamt before. He asked the shopkeeper how much it was. The woman, an older lady with a face like dry bark, paused for a beat too long. "You sure you want that one?" she asked, her tone half warning, half amused. Marcus chuckled awkwardly. "I don't know, I guess I just like the craftsmanship." "It came from an old theater that burned down," she added, as if tossing out trivia. "No name, no record, just turned up in a box of salvaged props." He took it home that afternoon. The puppet was heavier than it looked. The strings were tangled, the wood dusty and faded, but the joints moved smoothly, disturbingly smoothly. The more he examined it, the more impressed he became. The facial features were hand-carved but precise. The eyes were made of glass, yet deep enough that he swore he caught reflections where there shouldn't have been any light. Marcus cleaned it up, trimmed the frayed strings, and hung it on a beam in his workshop. He didn't intend to use it. It was more of a conversation piece, or so he told himself. But that night, as he sat in bed with a book, he found himself glancing at the hallway where the dim light from his workshop crept into the living room. He knew the puppet was in there, swaying slightly from the draft. That night, he dreamt of wood and fire, of strings tightening around his wrists. He didn't sleep well. Over the next few days, small things began to change. He found the Marionette in slightly different positions, not moved far, just subtle differences. A tilted head, legs dangling a few inches apart when they were together the day before. Once, its mouth was slightly open. He told himself it was gravity. The strings must have loosened. He adjusted them, rehung the puppet, tried to forget the dreams, which were now growing more vivid, long hallways lined with faceless figures on strings, a stage where he stood frozen, watching his own body bow to applause he couldn't hear. Then came the voice. It started faint, just a murmur, almost like background noise. The kind of sound you could mistake for a neighbor's TV or a breeze through an old vent. But one evening, as he was sanding a chair leg in his workshop, he heard it more clearly. "Don't let them cut the strings." He froze, looked around. Nothing. The Marionette hung silently in the corner, its painted eyes reflecting the yellow bulb overhead. He told himself it was the radio, though it hadn't been turned on. By the end of the week, he started dreaming with his eyes open. It happened while he was brushing his teeth. He looked up into the mirror and saw his reflection smiling, wide, too wide, though his own face was still. Behind him, the Marionette stood on the counter like a perched bird, one wooden hand raised to his shoulder. He snapped out of it a moment later, toothpaste dripping from his chin, alone in the bathroom. He laughed shakily. Too many late nights. He needed a break. He moved the puppet to a storage closet and shut the door. That night, the closet door was open. Marcus stood in the hall in the dark, staring at the marionette, which now rested in the center of the floor. Its legs were splayed like it had fallen, or been placed. The room was cold, unnaturally cold. He didn't pick it up, just shut the door again, jammed a towel at the base, and turned every light in the house on. Sleep became a stranger. His hands began to tremble. He'd lose time in the workshop, finding half-finished pieces he didn't remember starting. He tried to throw the puppet away, once. Drove to a river 30 minutes out of town, wrapped it in a garbage bag, and tossed it into the current. He heard it laugh. Not out loud, not in the air, in his head. A wet, clicking laugh, like wood tapping against wood. He drove home in silence, shaking. The next morning, it was back, hanging from the beam. But now there were more strings. They weren't attached to the marionette. They were attached to the ceiling. He followed them with his eyes, confused, until he realized they weren't new strings. They were shadows, and they ended on him, on his arms, his legs, his neck. He stopped eating, stopped going outside. The dreams became performances, elaborate stage shows where Marcus was the puppet, moving in stuttering jerks while a silent audience watched from the dark. Sometimes he heard the whisper of applause, sometimes just breathing. And then one night the dream changed. He was backstage, alone. The marionette sat in front of a mirror, brushing its carved hair with a wooden comb. It looked at him, slowly, and it said, "You're ready." The next morning, Marcus didn't get out of bed. He lay still, staring at the ceiling, feeling something unfamiliar in his limbs. Not exactly pain, but weight, a sluggishness, like his body no longer answered him with the same immediacy. When he finally sat up, he noticed a faint red line around his wrist, a small indentation, as though something thin and taut had rested there overnight. His thoughts drifted more than they used to. He'd start a task, boiling water, sanding a table leg, and find himself staring at nothing, sometimes for minutes, sometimes longer. The kettle would scream. The wood would smoke from over-sanding. He'd wake as if from a trance. Each time, the marionette was near, watching. Eventually, he moved it again, not out of fear, not really, but to give it a better view. It sat on a stool now, just beside his workbench, hands resting gently on its knees, strings draped loosely from the rafters above. Marcus didn't question how they had gotten there. That day, he found himself speaking aloud as he worked. "Maybe you were waiting for someone to see you," he said softly, smoothing a groove into a headboard. "People leave things behind too easily." He looked over his shoulder. The puppet hadn't moved, but he felt a response. Not words, an impression, like warmth from a fire that wasn't burning. That night, he slept without dreams. But in the morning, when he walked past the hallway mirror, he stopped. His reflection wasn't right. His shoulders hung too loosely, his neck tilted slightly left, like it wasn't holding his head with intent, but rather as a suggestion. Most disturbingly, his hands twitched once, just once, before falling still. He reached out and touched the glass. It felt cold, too cold. Something had shifted inside him, and he knew it. There was no dramatic possession, no sharp turn toward madness, just a gradual drift, a tethering. He began to feel safest when the puppet was near. It was, in a way, the only thing that saw him now. His phone collected dust. Neighbors stopped knocking. When a friend from town, Al, who'd known Marcus since they were teenagers, stopped by to check in, Marcus didn't answer the door, but he did listen from the other side. He could hear Al's voice muffled through the wood. "You in there, buddy? I saw your truck out front. You okay?" Silence. Al knocked again, then muttered something about coming back later. Marcus didn't move. He just watched the marionette, which now hung again, no longer perched, no longer sitting, suspended from the ceiling by its strings. It swayed slightly, though there was no breeze. Later that evening, Marcus found himself writing. He didn't remember sitting down with a pen, but when he blinked, there it was. A notepad filled with small, neat letters he couldn't recall forming. They weren't instructions, not exactly, just guidance. Face the crowd. Stop resisting. You were never the one pulling the strings. He stared at the final line for a long time. He didn't leave the house for days after that. The dreams stopped entirely, replaced by waking hallucinations, though even that word felt wrong. They didn't feel like hallucinations. They felt real. Soundless stage lights warming his skin, curtains closing in the corners of his vision, the unmistakable pressure of strings tightening at the back of his neck when he resisted too much. He began rehearsing, not consciously, but his movements became smoother, as if choreographed. When he reached for tools, it was with a dancer's precision. When he walked through his home, it was like he was gliding on a track. And always, always, the marionette watched. Sometimes it hung, sometimes it sat. Once, Marcus found it curled up on his bed like a sleeping child. He tucked it in. One morning, perhaps it was morning, time had started to collapse. He walked past a mirror again, but this time he didn't stop. He saw something that wasn't him. It had his face, but the smile was deeper, and the eyes gleamed like polished glass. Behind it, dozens of puppets dangled, their silhouettes swaying in a theater of shadows. He reached up to touch his face, and felt a string. It was thin, almost invisible. He tried to pull it, but his hand froze midair, hovering, trembling. He couldn't complete the motion. Something inside him held back. That night, the audience came. Not physically, not in any visible form, but Marcus felt them, hundreds, maybe thousands of unseen eyes fixed on him, applauding without sound, holding their breath. He stood in the center of his living room. The lights dimmed. He bowed. A spotlight, though no lamp or bulb hung above, illuminated the space around him. Marcus's living room was gone, or perhaps transformed. The floor beneath him felt like aged wood, the kind used in old theaters, hollow and resonant with the weight of movement. Shadows gathered at the edge of the light, soft at first, then pressing inward like curtains tightening. He didn't feel afraid. That realization came to him slowly, like water warming to a boil. He should have been terrified. But standing there, head bowed, he felt peace, or something that passed for it. The kind of numbness that comes after days of sleeplessness, after a life of restraint and quiet, always keeping things contained, precise, predictable. Now he was here, and someone else was pulling the strings. From the darkness behind him came the faint tap, tap, tap of wooden feet against the stage. Marcus didn't turn. He didn't need to. He knew it was the marionette. Its steps were light but deliberate, like a performer entering for the final act. It moved until it stood beside him, just at the edge of his vision, where light met shadow. He didn't need to see its face. He already knew it was smiling. A sound swelled around them, soft at first, like the rustle of fabric or breath caught in throats. Applause, distant, restrained, reverent. The audience was still hidden, but their approval pulsed in the air like heat. Marcus lifted his head. His arms rose with slow, graceful tension, his joints pulling back as if lifted by unseen cords. His legs followed, shifting into a stance he hadn't chosen. Every movement was deliberate, orchestrated, and yet he was inside it, watching, feeling. The marionette stepped in front of him. It bowed to the audience, and then it turned to face him. The strings that had once held it aloft were gone. Now, they were on him. A whisper passed between them, no sound, only a knowing. It was always meant to be you. Marcus didn't reply. He couldn't. His mouth opened slightly, not wide enough to speak, just enough to let in the idea that maybe he had always been waiting. That maybe the quiet of his life, the routines, the woodwork, the long silences and dusty corners, maybe it was all leading here. The marionette reached out. Its wooden hand touched his chest, gently, and then it stepped into him. Not like a possession. There was no violence, no scream, no rush of dark energy. It was a merger, smooth and clean. The weight of its form folded into his own, like a costume being zipped closed, like stepping into a memory that was always his. Marcus's eyes blinked once, and when they opened again, the stage was empty. The lights dimmed, the curtains fell. And in the real world, what was left of it, a man stood motionless in his workshop, smiling faintly beneath the dim glow of a single yellow bulb. In his hands, he held the marionette, or rather, what was left of it, its body now limp, hollow, like the shell had been used up. He hung it gently on the beam where it once had been. Then he turned and walked deeper into the house. Not like before, not like Marcus. His steps were graceful, timed, rehearsed, as though someone else were still pulling the strings.